There is a phrase so familiar it has become invisible. You have heard it in churches, seen it on walls, whispered it in prayers. Take up your cross and follow me. Most people assume they understand it. They picture suffering, sacrifice, endurance of pain. They believe Jesus was calling them to carry burdens through life. But what if everything you were taught about this passage is wrong? What if this phrase is not a call to suffering at all, but the most radical invitation to spiritual freedom ever spoken? Joel Goldsmith spent decades uncovering the mystical meaning hidden beneath centuries of misinterpretation, and what he found changes everything about how you live, pray, and experience God. The cross is not your pain. The cross is not your illness, your financial struggle, or your broken relationship. The cross represents something far more precise, something that, once understood, becomes the key that unlocks every door in your spiritual life. This is not theology. This is a living practice that transforms consciousness from the inside out. Today, you will discover what no Sunday school lesson, no seminary course, and no well-meaning pastor ever explained. You will understand why millions of sincere seekers carry unnecessary weight, and how one shift in understanding can lift that weight permanently. Stay with this. Your entire perception of spiritual life is about to change. To understand what Jesus truly meant, you must first understand what the cross symbolized in mystical tradition, long before Christianity adopted it as an emblem of crucifixion. In ancient spiritual teachings, the cross represented the intersection of two worlds, the vertical axis of divine spirit and the horizontal axis of human material existence. Every human being lives at that intersection. You are spirit expressing through a body in a world of form, time, and limitation. The cross is you, the meeting point of the infinite and the finite. And here is where most religious teaching makes its fatal error. It teaches you to worship the cross rather than understand what must happen at that intersection for true spiritual life to begin. Joel Goldsmith was precise about this. He taught that the great mystical secret of the cross is not endurance. It is surrender. Not surrender of your will to punishment, but surrender of the false identity that believes it lives apart from God. That false identity, what Goldsmith called the human sense of self, is what must be released. That is the cross you are asked to pick up and carry. You are not being called to suffer more. You are being called to stop pretending to be something you never were. The cross is the moment you look honestly at the false self, the fearful, striving, separate human self, and choose consciously to stop feeding it your belief, your energy, and your identity. Here is the profound truth that centuries of literal interpretation buried. The cross is a symbol of conscious dying to the personal self. In every mystical tradition, Sufi, Kabbalistic, Hindu, Christian, there is a recognition that the spiritual journey requires a death, not physical death, the death of the ego's claim to be the source of your life. Joel Goldsmith called this impersonalization. It is the practice of refusing to locate power, evil, or identity in persons, including yourself. When you truly take up your cross, you are picking up the willingness to stop being run by your personal history, your fears, your wounds, and your self-constructed story about who you are. This is not easy. It is not meant to be easy, and Goldsmith never promised it would happen overnight. This is a practice that unfolds over months, sometimes years. But the moment you begin, the moment you sincerely pick up that cross, something shifts in your inner world that cannot be reversed. You begin to see through the illusion of the separate self. Most people spend their entire lives adding to the personal self. More achievements, more protection, more identity. The mystical path moves in the opposite direction. It is a deliberate, conscious, and loving dismantling of everything you thought you were, so that what you truly are, pure spiritual consciousness, can finally live freely through you. Now comes the second half of the command. Follow me. And this, Goldsmith taught, is equally misunderstood. To follow Jesus in the mystical sense is not to imitate his biography. It is not to wear certain clothing, observe certain rituals, or repeat certain prayers. Following in mystical Christianity means following the same inner path that Jesus demonstrated. Jesus demonstrated one thing above all others: complete transparency to God. His life was not about personal achievement. It was about the total absence of a personal agenda, a life so surrendered to divine consciousness that miracles were not miracles at all, but the natural result of unobstructed spiritual flow. When you follow that path, When you take up the cross of surrendering the personal self and walk the road of spiritual transparency, you do not become less yourself. You become more truly yourself than you have ever been. You discover that beneath all the fear, striving, and identity protection, there is a self that is already whole, already healed, already one with the source of all life. This is the invitation, not to carry pain, but to lay down the false self that creates pain. Not to endure more, but to surrender what was never real to begin with. The next scenes will show you exactly how this works in practical life, through real human journeys, and through the specific techniques Goldsmith gave us to walk this path with clarity and courage. Consider a man named Harold. He came to Goldsmith's teachings after 17 years of chronic back pain that no medical treatment had resolved. He had prayed constantly, asking God to remove his suffering. He had bargained, pleaded, and wept. Nothing changed. Then someone placed a copy of Goldsmith's writings in his hands, and Harold read something that stopped him completely. God is not withholding your healing. There is no God separate from you, deciding whether you deserve relief. That sentence cracked something open in Harold. He had spent 17 years relating to God as an external authority, who might, if sufficiently petitioned, grant him relief. Goldsmith's teaching revealed the error. He was praying from separation. Every petition reinforced the belief that wholeness was somewhere outside him, and that he was not yet worthy of receiving it. Harold began the practice slowly, not expecting instant results, but genuinely shifting how he related to his own consciousness. Over several months, he stopped asking and began recognizing. Instead of, God, please heal me, his inner practice became, God is the only life present here. That life is whole. I am that life expressed. This is recognition prayer, the cornerstone of Goldsmith's approach. The back pain did not vanish overnight, but Harold reported that within weeks his relationship to the pain changed entirely, and over the following months the physical condition gradually improved. His doctors were puzzled. Harold was not. He had stopped fighting his body and started living from the truth of his spiritual identity. He had picked up his cross and followed. Now consider a woman named Carol. Wait, that name has been used. Meet Virginia. She was a school teacher who carried what she described as a crushing sense of unworthiness. For decades, she functioned well on the outside while privately believing she was fundamentally flawed, spiritually deficient, and permanently separated from God's grace. She attended church faithfully. She served her community, yet the inner darkness never lifted. Virginia's therapist helped her understand the psychological roots of her self-rejection. That work was valuable, and she honored it. But the deepest layer of her suffering required something therapy alone could not reach. It required a spiritual realization, not a belief, not an affirmation, but a genuine inner knowing that her sense of unworthiness was built on a false premise. Goldsmith's teaching on the cross spoke directly to her condition. The unworthiness she carried was a product of the personal self, the constructed identity formed by childhood wounds, religious conditioning, and cultural messaging. That self was not her true self. Taking up her cross meant consciously refusing to keep identifying with that wounded story, not by denying her pain, but by recognizing that pain was not her spiritual identity. Over many months of daily inner work, sitting in silence, practicing recognition, choosing again and again not to feed the unworthy story, Virginia experienced a gradual but profound transformation. The darkness did not disappear dramatically. It thinned. Then it lifted. She described it as the difference between being the wound and witnessing the wound from a place of unshakable inner light. There is a pattern in every genuine transformation story within Goldsmith's tradition. It never begins with dramatic external change. It always begins with a shift in what the person is willing to believe about themselves and about God. That willingness, that courageous openness to releasing the familiar false self, is the precise moment of picking up the cross. Joel Goldsmith wrote that most human suffering is not caused by what happens to us, but by what we believe about what happens to us, and more deeply, by who we believe we are while it is happening. If you believe you are a vulnerable, separate human being at the mercy of random forces, suffering becomes both inevitable and meaningless. But if you begin to recognize yourself as spiritual consciousness temporarily expressed in form, everything changes. This does not mean denying physical reality. Goldsmith was never an escapist. He honored the body, respected medicine, and encouraged people to use every appropriate resource available to them. The spiritual practice he taught was not a replacement for practical care. It was the deepest foundation beneath all care, the roots that allowed every branch of healing to receive true nourishment. What changes first is not always the body or the circumstance. What changes first is the inner atmosphere, the quality of consciousness you bring to your situation, from fear to trust, from petition to recognition, from separation to oneness. And it is from that changed inner atmosphere that outer conditions gradually, organically, begin to reflect a new spiritual reality. This is the path. It requires patience, honesty, and genuine commitment. Meet Leonard. He was a 53-year-old man who had built a successful business through relentless personal effort, only to watch it collapse during an economic crisis. He lost not only the business, but his sense of identity, his confidence, and his will to continue. He described himself as a man whose cross had crushed him rather than liberated him. He believed God had abandoned him in his worst hour. Leonard found Goldsmith's teachings through a friend who had walked a similar valley. What struck him first was Goldsmith's teaching on truly following the Christ path, which required releasing the identity built entirely on personal achievement. Leonard's whole sense of self was tied to what he had built. When it fell, he fell with it, because he had no self beneath the achievement to stand on. The practice Leonard began was simple but radical. Each morning, before any thought of business or rebuilding, he sat in silence and practiced one recognition. I did not create my life. God is the only creative principle present. My role is transparency, not construction. This was his cross, the daily surrender of the builder identity that had defined him for 30 years. Over 18 months, Leonard rebuilt, not the same business, but a new expression that arose from inner guidance rather than ego ambition. More importantly, he rebuilt his inner foundation. He told his friend, "I lost everything I had made, and I found everything I actually am." That is the fruit of the cross, not loss, revelation. If these transformation stories have stirred something real in you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment below. Which story resonated most deeply with your own journey? Now that you understand the foundational meaning of the cross and have seen how it works in real human lives, it is time to give you the practical tools Goldsmith developed for living this teaching daily. Because understanding is only the beginning. The cross must be carried, which means it must be practiced, not merely believed. And practice requires specific inner techniques that build the capacity for genuine surrender. The first complementary tool is what Goldsmith called the practice of the presence. It is deceptively simple. Throughout your day, not only in formal prayer time, you pause and consciously acknowledge the presence of God as the only life operating in and through you. Not God out there, not God whom you are trying to reach. God as the very consciousness reading these words right now. This practice dismantles the most fundamental assumption of the personal self, that you are separate from your source. Every time you pause and recognize presence, even for 30 seconds, you are reinforcing the spiritual truth that the cross represents. You are practicing the death of the separate self in the safest, most accessible way possible. Not through dramatic renunciation, but through consistent, gentle, daily recognition. Goldsmith recommended beginning with just 3 to 5 conscious pauses per day. In the morning before rising, at midday, and before sleep. Each pause requires nothing more than a sincere inner turning toward the recognition, God is here, God is all. I am the expression of that all-present life, simple, repeatable, and over weeks and months, genuinely transformative in ways that accumulate quietly, but permanently. The second practical tool is spiritual listening, and it is perhaps the most undervalued practice in all of Goldsmith's work. Most people approach prayer as speaking. They bring their requests, their gratitude, their confessions. All of this flows outward from the person toward God. But Goldsmith taught that the deepest prayer is not speaking at all. It is listening, creating inner silence deep enough that the still small voice of divine consciousness can be heard. This is profoundly challenging for modern people. The mind is trained to produce constant activity, analysis, planning, worry, commentary. Sitting in genuine inner silence for even 5 minutes can feel uncomfortable, even threatening to the personal self, because in that silence, the personal self has nothing to do, and it fears its own irrelevance. But this is precisely where the cross becomes real. When you sit in silence and resist the urge to fill it with spiritual noise, even good spiritual noise, you are practicing the surrender of the personal self at its deepest level. You are saying, through your silence, I have nothing to add. I have nothing to ask. I am only here to receive what you have already prepared. This is following Jesus into the Garden of Gethsemane, not to bargain, but to yield. Begin with 10 minutes of silence daily. Do not evaluate whether you heard anything. Do not judge the quality of your listening. Simply show up, become still, and remain open. Over weeks, you will notice subtle shifts, moments of unexpected clarity, feelings of inexplicable peace, a growing sense that something real is present in that silence. That is not imagination. That is presence responding to your willingness. The third tool Goldsmith gave us is impersonalization, and it deserves careful attention because it is frequently misunderstood. Impersonalization does not mean you stop caring about people. It does not mean you become emotionally detached or spiritually cold. It means you stop locating the source of problems, or the source of goodness, in persons, including yourself. When you look at someone who is ill and think, that person is sick, you are personalizing. You are accepting the appearance of limitation as the final truth about them. Goldsmith taught that the spiritually awake practitioner looks through the appearance and recognizes the only life present in that person is God's life, whole, complete, and untouched by the appearance of illness. You hold that recognition steadily, without argument, without anxiety. This is not denial of symptoms. It is the refusal to give symptoms the final word. It is the practice of seeing from the level of spiritual truth rather than from the level of material appearance. And this practice, sustained over time, has been the foundation of countless healing experiences documented throughout Goldsmith's ministry and in the testimonies of practitioners worldwide. Apply this to yourself as well. When fear arises, when limitation appears, when the personal self screams that something is wrong, pause. Impersonalize. Recognize that the fear is not your spiritual identity. The limitation is an appearance, not a law. You are not that fear. You are the consciousness witnessing it from a place of infinite spiritual wholeness. This shift, practiced consistently, gradually loosens the grip of every limiting pattern in your life. The fourth tool is what Goldsmith called nothingization, and it builds directly on impersonalization. Once you have refused to personalize a problem, the next step is to recognize it as having no spiritual substance, no divine authorization, and no ultimate power over your true life. You are not fighting the problem. You are withdrawing your belief in its reality as a power. This is subtle but critical. Most spiritual practice still treats problems as real opponents that must be defeated, healed, or removed. Even much positive thinking operates this way. You are still giving the problem enough reality to require an opposite force against it. Goldsmith's approach is more radical. The problem has no author in God. Therefore, it has no true existence. It is an appearance in consciousness, and consciousness, when awakened, simply does not feed it. Nothingization is practiced in silence. You do not speak it aloud as an affirmation. You do not argue with the problem in your mind. You simply sit with the recognition this condition has no God-ordained reality. There is only one presence, one power, one life, and in that life, this limitation has no foundation. Then you rest. You do not check for results. You do not repeat it anxiously. You recognize and release. The combination of these four tools, practicing presence, spiritual listening, impersonalization, and nothingization, gives you a complete inner practice for carrying the cross daily, not as burden but as discipline, not as suffering, but as the joyful, consistent work of a soul choosing truth over appearance, spirit over matter, reality over illusion. This is the way of the mystic. This is the way of the cross. Now it is time to speak honestly about the challenges. Because if you begin this path expecting smooth, uninterrupted progress, you will be discouraged by the first difficulty you encounter, and you will conclude that the teaching failed you, when in truth you simply were not prepared for the real terrain of inner transformation. Joel Goldsmith never promised an easy road. He promised a real one, and real roads have obstacles. The first and most common challenge is what practitioners call the silence drought. You sit for days, sometimes weeks, and feel absolutely nothing in your inner practice. No peace, no presence, no confirmation that anything is working. The silence feels empty rather than full. The mind wanders relentlessly. You wonder if you are doing it wrong, or if this practice is simply not meant for you. Goldsmith addressed this directly. He taught that the silence drought is not a sign of failure. It is often a sign of genuine depth work happening beneath the surface of consciousness. The personal self is being asked to release control, and it does not release quietly. The discomfort, the blankness, the wandering mind, these are the resistance of the personal self to its own surrender. This is the weight of the cross that Jesus described. The instruction in these moments is simple but demanding. Continue, not with force, not with anxiety. Simply return to the practice each day with the same sincerity you brought on day one. Think of it as tending a garden in winter. Nothing is visible above the ground, but beneath the surface, roots are deepening. Trust the process more than you trust the feeling. Feelings are products of the personal self. Spirit works beneath feeling, in territory the personal self cannot access. The second major challenge is the resurgence of old patterns precisely when you believe you have moved beyond them. You spend weeks cultivating inner peace, practicing the presence with growing consistency, and genuinely feeling a shift in your consciousness. Then something happens. A conflict, a health scare, a financial pressure, and you react from exactly the same fear-based patterns you thought you had transcended. The discouragement can be shattering. Meet Franklin. He had been practicing Goldsmith's teachings earnestly for 8 months when his elderly mother was diagnosed with a serious illness. Despite all his inner work, he found himself collapsing into terror, bargaining with God in desperate petitions. The exact prayer mode he had been working to move beyond. He felt he had wasted 8 months. He felt the teaching had abandoned him in his real moment of need. His teacher, a seasoned Goldsmith practitioner, told him something that changed his understanding permanently. She said, "The fact that you recognize the fear as a pattern rather than as truth, that is your 8 months of practice working. A year ago, you would not have seen it. You would have simply been it. The goal is not to never feel fear. The goal is to develop enough inner space to witness fear without being consumed by it." Franklin returned to his practice. He did not perfectly maintain mystical consciousness through his mother's illness, but he was able, more often than not, to return to recognition after each wave of fear. His mother received excellent medical care, and Franklin's inner work created an atmosphere of calm presence that his mother found deeply comforting. The cross was carried, imperfectly, humanly, and genuinely. The third challenge is perhaps the most spiritually dangerous: premature certainty. This is the state in which a person has learned the intellectual framework of Goldsmith's teachings, can speak about consciousness and impersonalization with fluency and confidence, but has not yet done the genuine inner work of surrender. The words become a spiritual performance. The teaching becomes an identity rather than a practice. Goldsmith was sharp about this. He wrote that the most difficult students to reach were often those who had studied the most, because they had accumulated enough knowledge to mistake familiarity for transformation. They could explain nothingization without practicing it. They could describe recognition prayer while continuing to pray petitionary prayer beneath their breath. The cross had become a theological concept rather than a lived experience. The antidote Goldsmith prescribed was ruthless inner honesty, not self-punishment, honesty. At the end of each day, ask yourself, did I actually practice today, or did I only think about practicing? When the challenging moment came, the difficult conversation, the health worry, the financial fear, did I turn inward to recognition, or did I react from the personal self and then explain it in spiritual language afterward? This kind of honesty is itself a form of carrying the cross. It requires setting aside the image you want to maintain of yourself as a spiritually advanced person and looking clearly at where you actually are. Goldsmith called this spiritual integrity, and without it, the practice becomes theater. Beautiful, inspiring theater that changes nothing at the level of lived experience. The fourth challenge is one that strikes sincere practitioners at the deepest level, the experience of unanswered recognition. You have practiced genuinely. You have sat in silence honestly. You have impersonalized and nothingized with real inner conviction. And the condition, the illness, the relationship difficulty, the financial pressure, has not changed. Weeks have passed, months, and the outer world has not reflected the inner work. What then? This is where Goldsmith's teaching demands its greatest courage. He did not offer a formula that guaranteed external results within a specific time frame. He was honest. Some conditions shift quickly, some shift gradually over years, and some do not shift in the way we expect at all. The cross is not a transaction. It is not a spiritual technique you apply to get a predetermined result. It is a way of being, a fundamental reorientation of your entire existence toward God as the only reality. Meet Audrey. She practiced for 2 years with deep sincerity while living with a chronic condition that did not fully resolve. She struggled with this. She questioned herself, questioned Goldsmith, questioned God, but she kept practicing, not because it was producing the results she wanted, but because in the silence, she had touched something real, a peace that genuinely surpassed her understanding, a presence that was undeniably there. Audrey eventually said something that captures the heart of this teaching. I came to be healed of a condition. I stayed because I found something more real than healing. That is not resignation. That is the deepest fruit of the cross. The discovery that the presence itself is the treasure, not merely a means to an end. If these truths about carrying the cross are speaking to something real in you, like this video to support this work, subscribe for deeper Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment below. Which challenge have you been facing on your spiritual path? You have understood the meaning. You have practiced the tools. You have walked through the challenges with honesty and courage. Now it is time to explore how this teaching integrates into the advanced terrain of daily life, not in the protected space of your morning silence, but in the marketplace, in the difficult relationship, in the body that demands attention, in the world that constantly presents itself as the only reality there is. Goldsmith was insistent on this point. Mystical Christianity is not a retreat from the world. It is a way of meeting the world from a completely different level of consciousness. The cross is not carried in a monastery. It is carried in the grocery store, in the boardroom, in the hospital room, in the moment your teenager says something that triggers every unresolved wound you carry. That is where the practice becomes real. That is where the cross has actual weight. The advanced integration begins with what Goldsmith called keeping the consciousness. This means developing the ability to return to spiritual awareness quickly, within seconds, not hours, when you are pulled out of it by the demands and provocations of ordinary life. It is a skill built gradually through consistent practice. No one develops it immediately, but everyone who practices consistently develops it eventually. Think of it as spiritual muscle memory. The more often you consciously return to recognition, the more times you catch yourself in reaction and choose awareness instead, the shorter the time between disturbance and return to peace. After months of practice, what once took an hour of inner work to restore might take 5 minutes. After years, it can happen in a single breath. This is the fruit of advanced practice, not immunity to disturbance, rapid, deep return. One of the most challenging arenas for advanced practice is the experience of injustice. When you or someone you love is genuinely wronged, through betrayal, discrimination, abuse of power, or cruelty, the personal self rises with entirely understandable fury. And the question becomes, does carrying the cross mean accepting injustice passively? Does following Jesus mean suppressing righteous anger and pretending harm did not occur? Goldsmith's answer was nuanced and important. No, impersonalization does not mean passivity in the face of genuine wrong. Jesus himself overturned the money changers' tables. He confronted the Pharisees with unflinching directness. He did not mistake spiritual surrender for doormat compliance. The mystical path includes the courage to act, to speak, to name what is wrong, but from a center of spiritual clarity rather than personal wrath. The difference is subtle but transformative. When you act from personal wrath, you are feeding the very consciousness of conflict that created the problem. When you act from spiritual clarity, moved by love and principle rather than wounded ego, your action carries a different quality of energy. It can be just as firm, just as direct, but it does not add to the sum of darkness in the situation. It introduces light into it. Meet Clarence. He faced serious workplace discrimination and chose to address it formally through every appropriate channel available. But he practiced Goldsmith's teaching throughout the entire process, returning daily to the recognition that neither he nor his adversaries were defined by this conflict. The outcome of his case was just, and he emerged without bitterness, not because he suppressed his anger, but because he used his practice to move through it into something cleaner and more powerful. Advanced integration also requires learning how to hold others in spiritual recognition, particularly those you love who are suffering. This is one of the most tender and demanding aspects of the entire path. When someone you love is in pain, the natural human impulse is to enter the pain with them, to feel it as deeply as they feel it, to carry it alongside them as proof of your love. And while empathy is sacred, Goldsmith taught a deeper form of service. He called it holding the high watch. It means that while you honor the reality of another person's experience, you do not collapse into agreement with the appearance as the final truth. You hold, in your own consciousness, the recognition of their spiritual wholeness, their true identity as the expression of God's own life, undiminished by whatever the body or circumstance is presenting. You love them enough to see beyond what they are showing you. This is profoundly counterintuitive. It can feel cold to those who don't understand it, but practitioners who have experienced being held in this way, being seen in their wholeness rather than merely in their suffering, consistently report that it has a tangible effect, not always a physical cure, but always a deepening of inner resource, a quiet strengthening of the spirit that allows them to face their condition with greater courage and peace. Goldsmith was clear that this practice requires genuine inner work, not just a positive thought held briefly before you return to anxiety. To truly hold the high watch for another person, you must first be genuinely grounded in your own recognition practice. You cannot give what you have not cultivated. This is why every scene in this teaching returns to the same foundation: your own daily inner work, your own cross, your own practice of following. The most advanced dimension of this teaching is what Goldsmith called living from the invisible. It is the gradual shift, occurring over years of sincere practice, from a life primarily organized around visible material reality to a life increasingly organized around the invisible reality of divine consciousness. This does not mean ignoring practical responsibilities. It means meeting every practical responsibility from a foundation that is not visible to the eye. Consider how differently two people can face the same external situation. One person faces job loss from the level of personal self, calculating worth, generating fear, projecting catastrophic futures. Another person faces the same situation from a practiced inner foundation, acknowledging the practical challenge while remaining rooted in the recognition that divine consciousness is the only true source of supply, opportunity, and direction. The outer situation is identical. The inner atmosphere is entirely different, and over time the inner atmosphere shapes the outer reality. Living from the invisible does not promise that you will always get the specific outcome you desired. It promises something more enduring, that you will meet every outcome from a place of spiritual rootedness that cannot be shaken by external events. This is what Paul meant when he wrote that he had learned to be content in all circumstances, not that all circumstances were pleasant, but that his inner life was no longer dependent on outer circumstances to sustain it. This is the advanced fruit of taking up your cross and following. After the surrender of the personal self, after the practice of recognition, after walking through challenge and disappointment without abandoning the path, what remains is a consciousness that is genuinely free, not free from difficulty, but free within difficulty. Not beyond the cross, but so familiar with it that carrying it has become the most natural thing in the world. You have traveled a long distance in this teaching. You began with a phrase so familiar it had become invisible. You have now seen it with entirely new eyes, not as a call to endurance, but as an invitation to the deepest liberation the human soul can experience. Now it is time to bring everything together and see clearly what your life looks like when you genuinely embrace this path, not occasionally, not theoretically, but as the organizing principle of your entire existence. The first fruit of genuine cross-carrying is what Goldsmith called an established peace. Not the peace the world gives, which is the temporary absence of conflict, but a peace that persists through conflict because it does not arise from circumstances. This peace becomes the background of your life rather than the occasional foreground. It is present in the difficult conversation, in the medical waiting room, in the sleepless night when fear visits and finds you no longer entirely at its mercy. This peace does not mean the absence of emotion. You will still feel grief, anger, fear, and longing, but you will feel them as experiences passing through a vast inner space rather than as walls closing in on a small trapped self. The difference is everything. Emotions that once lasted days begin to move through in hours. Patterns that once took months to shift begin to dissolve in weeks. Not because you are suppressing anything, but because you are no longer identified with it at the deepest level. People around you will notice something different about you, even if they cannot name it. There will be a quality of presence, a groundedness, a genuine listening, a calm that is not performance, that naturally creates safety and trust in those who encounter you. This is the light that Jesus described, not a virtue you manufacture, but the natural radiance of a consciousness increasingly transparent to the divine life it has stopped pretending to be separate from. The second great fruit is what Goldsmith described as a new relationship with prayer, and it is so different from what most people have known that it requires careful description. Prayer ceases to be a rescue operation and becomes a recognition ceremony. You no longer enter prayer desperate for a different outcome. You enter prayer to acknowledge what is already spiritually true, the wholeness, the completeness, the unbroken oneness of all life in God, and to allow that recognition to become the dominant reality of your consciousness. This shift in prayer changes your entire relationship with time. Petitionary prayer always projects the desired good into a future that has not yet arrived. You are always waiting, always hoping, always measuring the gap between where you are and where you need God to take you. Recognition prayer discovers the good already present, already woven into the fabric of your spiritual reality, and simply removes the perceptual barriers that were hiding it from your experience. Meet Constance. She had prayed petitionary prayers for 40 years, faithful, sincere, and increasingly exhausted. After encountering Goldsmith's teachings, she spent 6 months, slowly, imperfectly transitioning to recognition prayer. She described the shift as moving from being a beggar at God's door to discovering she had been living inside the house the entire time without knowing it. The door she had been knocking on was already open. She had simply been looking at it from the wrong side. This is what awaits you on the other side of the cross. Not a God who finally heard your requests and decided to act, but the discovery that the life you were seeking was the life you already were, that every healing, every provision, every guidance you needed was already present in the consciousness you were surrendering into. The cross was not the end of something. It was the doorway into everything. The third and perhaps most transformative fruit of this teaching is the dissolution of the fear of death, not through philosophical argument, but through direct spiritual experience. When you have genuinely practiced the surrender of the personal self, when you have repeatedly died to the ego's claim to be the source of your life, death loses its absolute authority over your inner world. Not because you become reckless with your physical life, but because you discover that the deepest part of you was never born and therefore cannot die. Goldsmith spoke about this with great gentleness and great clarity. He taught that the fear of death is the root of nearly all human suffering, the shadow that falls across every experience of joy, every achievement, every relationship. Because beneath every fear, if you follow it far enough, you find the fear of annihilation. The personal self clings to existence with a desperation that underlies all anxiety, all grasping, all violence. But the Christ consciousness, the state that Jesus both demonstrated and invited you into, knows no such fear, because it has no birth certificate and no death certificate. It is the eternal life of God expressing through form, and when the form changes, the life continues. This is not wishful thinking. It is the direct testimony of every genuine mystic across every tradition who has walked far enough into the silence to touch what cannot be touched by time. You do not need to fully grasp this to begin the journey. You only need to be willing to carry your cross, to surrender the personal self, one day at a time, one practice session at a time, and follow the path that Jesus walked before you. The understanding will deepen as you go. The fear will lessen as your practice roots. And one day, perhaps not soon, but certainly, you will know from the inside what all the words have been pointing toward. You began this journey today with a phrase you thought you knew. You end it with a practice, a path, and a possibility that most people on this earth never discover. Not because it is hidden from them, but because they were never shown where to look. Now you have been shown, and that changes your responsibility, not as a burden, as a gift. The gift of knowing what the cross actually means, and what following actually requires. The path ahead of you is not dramatic. It is daily. It is a morning of silence before the world demands your attention. It is a pause in the middle of a difficult conversation to recognize the spiritual truth beneath the human appearance. It is the honest admission, at the end of a hard day, that you reacted from the personal self again, and the equally honest return, without self-punishment, to the practice. It is the accumulation of 10,000 small surrenders that over months and years become a transformed consciousness. Joel Goldsmith walked this path. He was not born enlightened. He was not granted a special grace unavailable to you. He was a man who took the invitation of Jesus with absolute seriousness, who practiced until the practice became presence, and who then spent the rest of his life showing others the way. He showed you today. The question that remains, the only question that has ever mattered on the spiritual path, is not whether this is true. It is whether you are willing to carry it. Take up your cross. Not the cross of suffering you never chose. The cross of conscious surrender you are choosing right now. Follow, not into doctrine, not into performance, but into the same transparent, God-filled, fear-released consciousness that Jesus demonstrated and that has been waiting inside you, patiently, for exactly this moment. Your transformation does not begin someday. It begins in the silence after this sentence ends. If your understanding of the cross and of your own spiritual potential has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith teachings, like this video, subscribe for more transformative mystical wisdom, and comment, "I take up my cross," to declare your commitment to this path and confirm that something real has shifted in you today.